in the group?
Finally, yes. Thank you.
All right. Let's admit everybody. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back and Happy New Year. Just give it another minute and then Sean will kick us off at 5. All right, 5 o'clock. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Just a quick reminder that this meeting is being recorded as well as live streamed on Facebook. And please use the raise hand feature. You can find it in the bottom deck to raise your hand when you would like to speak. With that, Sean, take it away.
Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'd like to centering exercise to get things started, and then we'll do roll call. I'd like to invite you to join me in a centering our conversations tonight. First, I will read a statement. Then I will ask you to join me in a breathing exercise to help focus, to bring focus and thoughtfulness to the conversations of today. Today, we convene to listen and learn from each other through reflection and discussion. As we reevaluate and improve our public safety practices, we'll elevate the voices and experiences of the communities who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by inequitable systems. We thank all those who have advocated and worked on dismantling injustices in Tigard and our broader community. We build off their efforts to create more equitable and just outcomes for people of all backgrounds and abilities. Okay. Now we'll do a breathing exercise together. You may turn off your monitor for this portion. Close your eyes and gaze softly downward. Feel the chair under your legs. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out your mouth. Feel your hands in your lap. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out your mouth. Feel your feet on the ground. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out your mouth. Slowly open your eyes and to begin to breathe normally. Thank you all for participating and creating space with me. Okay, Kim, do you want to do roll call?
Yes, thank you. Commander McDonald.
Here.
Officer Nunn.
Here.
Shelby Rahala.
Here.
Michael O'Brien.
Here.
Elise Patera won't be joining us this evening. Emilio Calderon? No. Liz Newton won't be joining us this evening. John Trin?
Here.
Jimmy Brown?
Here.
Lee Landers?
Here.
Lee Lofgren?
I'm here.
Justin Lowe?
Here.
Annie Rauda?
Here.
Valerie Sasaki?
I'm here.
Sean Stoldryer?
Here.
Nick Dermer?
I am here, thank you, but having camera difficulty right now.
Understand, thank you. And Jeff Mott?
Here.
Sean, that is roll.
Wait, I'm so sorry, Kim. I know I told you I would be late, but I am here now. Sorry, I had school thing run late. Sorry.
No, you're fine. You missed your name by like 3 names. Oh, Sean, you're muted.
Thanks. Kim, I didn't see any public comment today. Did you see anything?
No, there was no public comment today.
All right. Tonight, no community members have joined us to speak. Public comments are vital to the board's mission, and we welcome community feedback on our work. If you have comments for the board, Written testimony must be submitted by 4:30 p.m. the day of the scheduled meeting. If you would like to speak at our meeting, please email our staff at the email address presented on the screen. Okay, all right. With that, Chief, would you please do your update?
I'll be happy to. Again, Happy New Year to everybody. It's great to see all of you. Justin, it's nice that you don't have class anymore and you can be back with us. You were missed. The only update is really a follow-up request. If I reminding you guys all of an ask that we have for this upcoming budget process is to fully fund the professional standards sergeant's position. Again, it was a proof of concept last year using either vacancy savings or federal asset forfeitures. I think we're able to actually do it out of vacancy savings and not have to drop from there. I think it's worked very well. I think it falls well within what we're trying to do on accountability, transparency. You got to hear a little bit about what Sergeant Fox at that time was doing. It goes into peeling back the deeper layers of the use of force and some of the other mandatory reporting. This will help me be able to do the quarterly reports in a manner that I think I've heard all of you desire to have. And so just looking for maybe a board support if it passes. And that's really my updates for today.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Chief.
So in advance of this meeting, we sent out a draft endorsement of the professional standards sergeant. I'd be happy to share that on my screen so we can all kind of take a look. But first, is there any questions about that position that you've had now that you've had the memo for about a month? Yes, Valerie.
One thing that I noticed about it is that we're using, this is vacant transit sergeant position dollars to do this. Is it anticipated that there's not going to be a need to fill that role with respect to the TriMet position going forward?
You know, Valerie, it's a great question. At this point, we've been kind of monitoring every step of the way, and Commander Rogers, who happens to be the presenter tonight, he is our liaison to TriMet. And there have been multiple reasons why we've slowly pulled back. First and foremost was we needed the bodies. And so we pulled them back almost 2 years ago. And secondly, with everything that was happening downtown Portland, getting into a lot of the politics, responding to their issues. And as you recall, we did a kind of analysis of a use of force, and there was, a fair portion of that force came from within, helping either TriMet activities and or backing up Port of Portland. And then also, lastly, transitioning from Portland, getting out of it, and Multnomah County taking over and trying to build up a new process. And so at this point, there is nothing in the near future that would lead us to believe that we would want to jump in. However, if we do, and they have things that are pleasing to us, we did reserve 2 officer positions. We wouldn't need a sergeant until maybe we had a full contingency of 5 or more like we did before, and they have enough sergeants. So that's a great question. And at this point, I don't see anywhere in the near future, in the next 1 or 2 budget cycles, where that would change. And if it does, TriMet fully funds those positions. So we would receive funding in its entirety, both for the sergeant and the officers.
Great, thank you, Chief.
Thank you. Any other questions before we start talking about the recommendation? Great. Jeff.
Thank you. What happens, I guess, currently with internal investigation? You said in the memo, a lot of the work will be around reviewing operations divisions, complaints, that kind of stuff. What happens to those internal investigations after they're complete? Does the person who filed the complaint get a resolution? Or
yeah, and Commander Rogers is going to actually go into that in his presentation today. And so if if you need more information on that before you take a vote, perhaps we can do it after Commander Rogers' presentation, if that's helpful.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So that is I guess the question that's on the table. Do you want to talk about the recommendation now, or do you want to wait until after Commander Rogers' presentation this evening? If you, yes, Valerie.
I think based on what Jeff just said, I think I'd rather wait, but that's just my preference.
Great, I see thumbs up, so we will go ahead and wait on the endorsement until after the commander's presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. So Commander Rogers, you still with us? All right, and
Yeah.
Thank you. So if you want to take away the presentation, I think Tammy's got your slide deck.
Good evening. All right, my name is Bob Rogers. I've been with the city since 1997. Currently been in the role I'm in since about 2009. The topic I was asked to discuss tonight is the discipline and personnel complaints. It's basically two separate topics. You know, they're not necessarily linked all the time, but trying to put that together for you guys this evening. I hope you enjoy this presentation and it's informative. Next slide. Next slide. I'd ask that you guys hold your questions if you can till the end. If you can keep like a little notepad of some of the questions. If it's really emergent, you need to break in, let me know. Otherwise, I appreciate you guys allowing me just to continue with the flow. Next slide. All right, so based on several different topics that are out there, you've heard a lot about police discipline that's going on of late. Police disciplinary procedures have been a source of frustration, not only for police executives, but also with the community. It's been with the unions. It's been with the police officers as well. Sometimes you end up hearing, you know, some of the officers commiserating as well. There's a really good research PDF that is well known among my peer group, Police Discipline, A Case for Change, written by D. Stevens. He came out of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area. He's a retired chief now, but he wrote a whole series of really salient points on police discipline and how it's changed in the modern police reform era. The one area about the administration of police discipline where there's agreement among unions, among police officers, among the community, among executives, has been the amount of time it takes to demonstrate that we're being accountable to the communities we serve. And we take oaths to do that. We spend quite a bit of time training our staff. And I think you're going to see there's some areas we can focus on. Next slide. Okay, so the best situation for a police department, its employees, in the community is to create an environment in which formal disciplinary process obviously is one of the last options. And it's preferably for us the one that's least used. Commander McDonald and I commiserate routinely within the Tigard Police Department about how, you know, we're coaches, we're playing coaches out there on in the realm, and that we'd prefer to go ahead and use almost every other exhaustive measure alongside our union representatives to make sure that we're modifying behavior back to something that's acceptable and something that we're proud of. You know, and creating that environment is focused. It's been focused for us. Over the last probably 12 years, we've had a couple chiefs come in, starting with Bill Dickinson and then Al Orr continuing it on. But really, I like to call the finishing work we've done in the last 4.5 years under Chief McAlpine is just being able to quantify and explain what we're doing from a transparent perspective. And that's crucial for us, to the officers we serve. That's our first duty as police administrators, as a chief, as a commander, as a lieutenant, as the command team, is making sure that we're speaking with one voice, we're being consistent and predictable. Next slide. These are some of the cases for change, some of the things that we've identified that are priorities with respect to ensuring that police discipline starts at the very beginning. So finding employees, the right people is the foundation. Obviously, establishing clear standards during the selection process. We spent quite a bit of time doing that. And in the last, as I said, the 4.5 years, we've really tried to take on every chief grafts their DNA into a police organization. So currently we're firing on, I would say we're reaping the benefit of having a chief who's been here for a while. This is the best fruits right now. You're beginning to see the officers we've hired. They're coming to maturation. They're in that 3 to 5 year zone where they're able to go out and perform in almost independent of supervision on the calls they're on. And they already know our values. They know the mission and they know the goals of the police department. That always starts at the hiring process, but we're beginning to see that maturation of some of the officers that we hired at the beginning of the McAlpine period. Next slide. Training, again, is one of those things that, for consistency's sake, officers have to have those skills and the knowledge to effectively do their jobs for the community. And it has to be high quality, entry level. You know, you guys have heard quite a bit about our force response, about our training, and the needs we have to maintain, and the high expectations that the city of Tigard and the Washington County brand of law enforcement expects from us. Police departments and their employees must also commit to that rigorous lifelong learning concept. So you're never sitting static. You're always seeking those new best practices, those things that are evidence-based, and looking for the solutions that others have tried. We learn by doing, just like any other career field, whether it's medicine or law, any field of excellence. And we hope we're getting towards that. Next slide. Clear expectations always start at the top. They're identified by senior leadership, whether it's the city manager's office, the city council, you know, our elected officials, giving us what is our mission. The chief puts those into words for us, and then the commanders and the lieutenants have to start instilling the vision. We work with our values and our ethical standards to start creating those actual ground level concrete messages. Part of those are codified within our policies and procedures, but those are, you know, they're black letter text on paper. So what we're trying to do is bring it to life. We're trying to bring those situations where a framework is established and it's an acceptable performance. The chief has one of those sayings about do the right thing for the right reason at the right moment. Those types of concepts of thinking about what's the right thing to do in this moment. Okay, they have to not only be clear and understandable language, but they have to be reinforced in our day-to-day operations. That's sometimes the hardest part, is we're a 24/7, 365, you know, COVID environment, holidays, it doesn't matter, birthdays, all types of stuff. Our officers are asked to go out into the field and perform, and they have to be at their best. So we have to make sure that our operations that are going forward out there also represent our best. There's the old saying about many members of the community just don't interact with us very often. And when they do, generally it's on one of their worst days. So we have to remember our side of that equation is a lot like being an emergency room doctor. You expect them to be professional. You expect them to be attentive, awake, engaged, professional. Those types of things are crucial. Next slide. So effective and engaged supervision. This has been hammered home since I became a sergeant back in the early 2000s. One of the most important steps in creating a healthy environment for an organization is making sure that frontline supervisors have what they need and they feel supported. They feel like the expectations of them is clear. They're responsible for translating the basics. I mean, we can't be there all the time. The chief, you know, the commanders and lieutenants, we like to call, you know, sometimes us the adult supervision, only because we've been around the block for so long. But really, the sergeants are there all the time. They're out in the field. They're there when calls are hazy, and they're there to help clarify what's going on. So making sure that they feel those things are crystal for them as well. Emphasizing some of the things and not others. They establish organizational expectations. So we remind the officers what's important now. that WIN concept. It's officer safety, it's community safety, it's making sure that we're projecting as best we can a consistent law enforcement message. Effective supervision is critical for creating an environment in which coaching, not the threat of discipline, helps mold officers into professionals. So again, drawing back in that effective supervision, if it's done well, can obviously circumvent a lot of the things that end up following down the path of discipline. Discipline is it's the biggest, heaviest sword that management has, and we prefer obviously not to use it. Next slide. Performance standards and reviews. This is another thing that we work with HR. We work with, the city leadership to make sure that our job standards and work standards are periodically reviewed to make sure that we're asking officers to do within certain skill classes what we're paying them and training them to do. We work shoulder to shoulder with our union, making sure that what they're seeing in other agencies and in other literally other markets that our officers could move to. We're making sure that they feel like they're engaged. It's a difficult process for agencies such as ours, but it's setting clear standards. You don't want to end up having one agency that basically has officers that have very little expectations, and then your agency is overwhelming, is very draconian or very militaristic. We're trying to move towards a consistent Washington County brand where officers that work in Sherwood or Beaverton or Hillsborough or Tigard are on that same consistent expectations of training and also of standards. Some of these other comments kind of, speak to themselves too. Whatever standards and review processes are in a department, it's important that the officers understand what they are. So what are you asking me to do today? What am I going to be evaluated on? If I want to be a detective or I want to be a motor officer, what's the standard that you're asking me to go out and do? We don't have quotas for officers to go write tickets or arrests, but we do have engagement where we ask officers to be in their districts, to be visible, that their discretionary time is well used, whether it's contacts that are totally innocuous or whether they're ones that are enforcement based. So those are things that we have to bring to life in words for our officers. Next slide. Okay, complaint reception and investigation procedures is crucial for a police department. The department must have effective complaint reception protocols. That instills in the officers that it's going to be very, very predictable. So every officer that's been working for any amount of time has been complained on, has probably been cited for a policy violation, and just wants to understand, what are you saying I did? What are you saying is the path that I should have done next time? Many times we end up encountering community members and they're just not happy. I know it says citizens in here and I apologize for the vernacular. I didn't have the time to go in and edit all those out. I apologize. But when we engage the community at whatever place they're at, sometimes they're either confused with the services we've provided, or we don't have the time, or we didn't take the time to explain what took place effectively. So when we get a complaint that comes in from a community member, just like any employee in any size organization, you want to be notified what took place. And then the community member, or if it's a fellow employee of our department, that they're effectively kept informed of what are the timeframes where I can expect or hear back. Are they communicated with? That's something that we've gotten a heck of a lot better over time in doing. When a complaint comes in, we acknowledge it. We do that in writing, and we try to do it if they'll allow us to. The community member or the employee, whether they want to be anonymous or however that complaint comes in, we try to meet them on the ground that they asked us to meet them on, whether it's a phone call or an email or a letter, just to let them know what the process is and what steps are going to happen next. That's, again, a consistent and predictable message we're trying to establish. Next slide. You guys are well-versed in the technology that's changed. For us, I started in the early 90s. Technology has just blazed forward. And many agencies like Tigard now have body-worn cameras in addition to in-camera systems, in addition to AVL, the automatic vehicle locators, all the things that we're able to establish how fast the officer was going, where you end up getting a complaint, small or otherwise, that an officer was just tearing across town. We're able to establish most times who that officer was, and was he or she, were they on a call? Is there some reason that they didn't have their lights and siren on? So the technology has made our job a lot easier. It's gotten to the point now where we're able to activate a body worn camera while an officer's in the field and on a call to actually be there with them if the circumstances are correct. And that's pretty neat. If you think about it, it's never been like that before. Next slide. This is something that has to come up in law enforcement. It's this, the lore of the code of silence. I would tell you, I was an officer in Arkansas for my first 6 years, and you've heard of the thin blue line, the code of silence, this wall that we put up against the community. And I would tell you that it has existed in law enforcement. It's been the same type of system that if somebody's in a professional organization, whether they're pilots or whether they're lawyers or doctors, or you insert whatever type of professional you're talking about, police officers always felt, I'm not going to be the one that points to another person and says they're doing wrong. I would tell you Oregon's had a healthy environment since I came out here in the late 90s, where our expectations are extremely high for law enforcement. Part of that is because we pay very well and we expect higher levels of education for our officers. And to be quite frank, you get what you pay for. The expectations of law enforcement are quite high. And DPSST has now even enacted other changes to ensure, and they've been around for a while, but to make sure that even among agencies that background standards have been risen or have been consistently raised across the entire state. So an officer, whether they're in Myrtle Point or whether they're out in Pendleton, have the same background standards as officers in the city of Tigard. The code of silence, though, officers have seen too many examples where you have to be able to report something. You have to feel like you're not going to be singled out. That code of silence, where you're going to be singled out by your fellow police officers or by your administrators or by the community as some type of a rat or some other type of connotation to it, that's melted away. We actually have policies in place that make it quite clear that this is a job. It's not a TV show. So you should take it quite seriously. The amount of professionalism that's expected of an officer. Next slide. All right, let me see if I can move something here because I can see the rest of the slide. Obviously, the policies, rules, and collective bargaining agreements, these are all the facets you can see listed that begin to affect discipline within law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement agencies are unique. We have the ability to be engaged in something that's pretty unique. An extrajudicial use of deadly force is something that's been afforded to a law enforcement officer for a long period of time, and a great burden is placed on us because of that. Department policies guide us. The city of Tigard has policies, whether they're personnel rules or other rules that apply within risk management or other best practices within our organization. DPSST, the Oregon revised statutes that give us both the authority to do certain actions, but also restrain our powers that have been afforded to us with those rules. And there's multiple, whether they're Oregon administrative rules or OSHA rules, or lots of rules that guide our conduct. The contract actually talks about it. At the very closing of this presentation, I discuss just a portion of that. Past precedents and fairness always have to guide our discipline. It's important that when a new chief comes in, that they recognize what took place in the past and that they're making sure that they're being fair going forward, or they express the changes they've made. Our new chief that came in, when Chief McAlpine came in, she changed some things, but she also recognized a lot of the precedents and a lot of the work that our TPOA and the police leadership team had worked very hard to ensure that there was a great communications between us with respect to those past precedents. There's also new and emerging issues. No one can change what the legislators or city councils or our elected officials choose to do. When they change certain things, we have to make sure that we're being clear. That happened a lot since the George Floyd movement and moment that has taken place in our country. So you're seeing those new issues become emergent where we have to do certain things. Chokeholds are just one example. You guys are well versed on several others. And then the community expectations. Each community is a little different, whether it's Pendleton or it's Redmond or whatever agency you're talking about. If they're in a different part of the state, they have community expectations as well. And many of those have to do with being present, not so much within the statutory, because DPSST controls the overall state with respect to some of the statutory powers, but it comes down into community expectations, goals, how we treat some of our unhoused community members compared to how other communities might treat them, how we treat juveniles or high school issues or minors in possession of certain, how we choose to engage with them, whether we have a peer court or we have some type of other interventions. Those are community expectations. Next slide. So I'll go through this rather quickly, but counseling is an informal process. It involves coaching. It involves, instead of documenting something, most times counseling can take place when it's not documented, although they can be recorded inside of performance evaluations. It's an informal process. So what you're asking is, you're asking an employee to understand something most times in coaching. Hey, look, this is a policy. You're supposed to turn your reports in before you go on your weekend. All reports have to be done. Doesn't matter how small you think they are. That's a process, one rule we have. And if an officer doesn't do that, he could expect or she could expect to be confronted by saying, hey, you're not completing your reports by the weekend. You're actually stacking them up on a weekend and costing overtime. So I'm telling you that's not efficient. That's a coaching method. If that continued down that path, obviously, if I talk to them and then talk to them, I would end up writing that down. It would be one of those things that's recorded in, obviously, in a document. We carry a side file. It's a performance file that goes between written evaluations. So after I write the evaluation, if I choose to enter that problem with policies inside of the performance evaluation, the annual performance evaluation, then the employee has the process of rebutting it. They can actually write a response saying, hey, that wasn't that big of a deal. Everybody does it. Or, Sergeant Rogers is just focused on me. I do a lot of other great things. They have an opportunity to rebut it. Most times, those documents that are inside of an evaluation are purged. So you had your opportunity to confront your supervisor with that problem. Unless they're crash related. Sometimes we have officers that end up having a series of crashes within a certain period of time, and a city policy makes us carry those annually. We have like a 3-year moving window of unsafe driving habits. Obviously, we're like taxi cab drivers or Uber drivers. We're driving all the time in our vehicles, so you can expect, obviously, we end up having some type of inadvertent motor vehicle crashes, more than the average motoring public. Well, we're here also to talk about discipline, which is the formal process where counseling fails, or it's of such a level where the conduct is egregious. So certain actions are agreed upon via the contract that they're going to be disciplined. Whether we're going to, if you end up getting to a letter of reprimand, a punitive transfer, a loss of assignment, a suspension, a demotion, and obviously a termination of employment, these are all very formal processes. And there's also steps that have to take place that don't necessarily at all take place during the counseling process. We invite the union many times into counseling sessions, whether we're required to do so or not, just to ensure we're being consistent as well and transparent with our police union. And they have a lot of great advice for us as well. Next slide. I don't know if this is too busy. Jamie, can you see this?
Yeah, I can see it. It's not too bad on my screen.
Okay, this is something that goes into our policy. I apologize if the font is really small. I'm going to break it out in a second. At the bottom, you see department inquiries. Then it goes up into minor policy violations. Then we have level 3, level 2, and level 1. Level 1 being the apex. Off to the side are some basic additional informations and some descriptions. I'm going to break those out for you, but I'm actually going to go from the bottom of the pyramid going up. Next slide. So a department inquiry is a chain of command or a professional standards inquiry. Oftentimes they have no disciplinary nature to them at all. An inquiry is just documenting that first preventable, like a minor property damage only or a preventable vehicle crash is the best example. So Officer McDonald is driving down the road. He goes to turn left. He doesn't see a car. He's in a marked unit. He ends up rear-ending somebody. He's looking to the right. He should have been looking to the left, and that's where he ends up hitting somebody. I bring Officer McDonald in. I confront him with the fact that we expect him to drive safely and that he was at fault for that crash. That ends up being a preventable crash, and that would result in a chain of command or a department inquiry. We expect our officers to drive safely at all times, just like you would expect UPS or FedEx or any other vehicle-based servant provider, ambulance drivers, fire trucks, all of them. They end up expecting their employees to do that. So that'd be one example. They're documented and they're considered for assignments and promotions and for other supervisory input decisions when requested. So these things don't go away. They sit in a file. And if there's repeated conduct, then they can be elevated to the next level. They can be entered into performance evaluations. They fall into the side file. So that would be one of those performance files that lives in the space between evaluations. So one supervisor knows what another supervisor is recording of one of their direct reports. It's also interesting because they have the ability, all members, to include me, to go in and ask the chief, hey, I want to see my performance file. I want to see what you have in my side file. And she'll produce that record for me so I can see where I'm at. Is there anything inside my file? Next slide. This is continuing on about the chain of command. It also talks about investigators receive that information demonstrated in the complaint. They determine whether it's unfounded. They resolve complaints to the satisfaction. If they're unsubstantiated, they review videos. The complaint may be administratively closed at that time without a formal investigation. Sometimes we end up getting a complaint and we're able to review the video and find out that it didn't take place at all. And we're able to send back a letter to the community member that made the complaint saying, I don't know what you thought you heard, or what you believe the officer said, but we have a body worn camera of the event, or we had an in-car video, or we have some type of an external mechanism, and we're able to unfound that complaint. We're able to resolve it. We're sorry for the impression, words to the effect like that. Investigators can document the complaint, and then a second level reviewer may administratively close. So it's not just the person that's reviewing it. It has to be a second level person. So either a lieutenant or the professional standards would review that. In our department, a chief reviews every complaint anyways. So at the end of the day, she's going to see every complaint that goes across the department. Many agencies aren't like that. Ours is unique. We have a very engaged chief, as you guys well know. Next slide. All right, minor policy violations. Now you're getting into something where coaching or non-disciplinary corrective action, it's a minor disciplinary issue. Aggravating factors can come into place. Minor policy violations could be late to work. So you show up for work without a piece of equipment that you're required to have on. Could be forgetting to do some type of a mechanism. You go to a domestic disturbance and you fail to give out an advisement of all the resources that are available. That's in our policy and you're expected to do it. You didn't write it in the report. We confront you about it and you're honest. So these are one of those types of things where it's a minor policy violation. Our expectations are beyond that prior level. It was an expectation of you and you didn't meet it. Hope that makes sense. Next slide. Now you're getting into something a little bit more firm. These are things where you're talking about misconduct. You're talking about repeated minor policy violations. This could be poor driving and we end up reviewing the video and we end up seeing that it just was unsafe. And you're actually causing damage, crossing perhaps like a median, and you end up breaking a tire or causing damage. There's been other times where officers have had equipment that has come up missing, whether it's our keys or an access card, a cell phone, some type of a repeated violation, whether it was a minor one or it was one that was perhaps you left either a piece of equipment on the top of the car or dropped it when it should have been retained in a certain way. One example of this that happened not long ago was we're required inside of our police cars to have our shotguns retained with a mount that secures them. And when officers put them in the beginning of their shift, sometimes they forget to lock that bar in. Well, they take off. You can imagine as soon as you go to your first stop, one of those shotguns goes forward and hits one of these very expensive Panasonic Tough Books and breaks the screen. Well, we have a policy in place that says, first off, you're supposed to restrain the shotgun because it's a tool, a defensive tool that needs to be restrained, but also you cause damage as a result of that. That would be an example of a level 3 violation. They can be anywhere from a letter of reprimand all the way up to 40 hours suspension, depending on the severity or the nature of the incident. The one I'm describing ended up being a reprimand. So that's a formal disciplinary process where you confront the officer and you say, our expectations are higher, and this is what the discipline ends up being. Turns out there were prior incidents with respect to that. So next slide. You're getting into something a little bit more serious now. You're talking about up to a 40 hours to 240 hour suspension, an involuntary demotion. These are major misconducts here. This falls into the realm where you're talking about it could be excessive force. It could be some type of an issue where an officer uses the wrong tool and causes an unanticipated injury, some type of a cash handling. You're supposed to, over a certain amount of money, have a supervisor present when you're inventorying it, and you didn't. You turned it into evidence, whether it's a mistake with respect to evidence, booking in evidence correctly or failing to book in evidence correctly. These are major policy violations. They're ones that we expect every officer who's on their own, who's been signed off to be in a solo status, their expectations are they're going to be able to meet these. These are the ones that could result. Obviously, you're seeing a week off or up to 240 hours is suspended without pay. That's a significant hit right there. Or a demotion as well. So these also affect supervisors on failing to be present, failing to engage, failing to supervise, or make the right call. And then let's go to the last one. Next slide. These ones kind of speak for themselves. These are the ones you end up seeing within the system at large. These are where untruthfulness, insubordination, or failure to obey a supervisor in the field. And when we say failure to obey a supervisor in the field, that's where I'm telling you not to do something, like not pursue somebody, not to enter a house and you choose to do it on your own, or outside my presence, outside of my control. You lose your DPSST certification is one example of a level 1. You have to be certified, just like a doctor has to have a license, a lawyer has to have a license, an aircraft pilot has to have a license. We do too. In Oregon, a law enforcement officer has to have credentials from DPSST. These are willful acts. So these are things that we're able to go through and say there was a mental culpable state for this. So it's a failure to do something that you were expected to do, or a willful refusal to do something as well. There are substance tests that are required periodically within law enforcement. And also there's sexual conduct on duty, acts of workplace violence or harassment, discrimination, fraud, ethical breaches. You can see any kind of felonious behavior. And then you're talking about improper use of force, so serious physical injury or death. Any one of those things are level 1 violations. These are presumptive punishments. The recommendations are demotion or dismissal. They're serious criminal. Obviously, if you're convicted of a felony or convicted of a felony, you're going to be you're no longer being able to be DPSST certified, so you can't be a police officer. Let's go to the next slide. As with everything, there's mitigating factors. Efforts were made to correct the problem, receptive to correction. They displayed proper attitude. acts that would not have come to light without their own reporting. We're required to report policy violations. I've had to do it with my boss several times. Member tenure to the assignment. So how long have you been doing the job? You know, I'm a 30-year police officer. Kathy's tolerance for my level of misconduct is pretty small. You know, we have officers that have been working for us less than 30 days or 60 days. And their tolerance is a little bit more expansive for them not knowing the policies. Even though you have exemplary rules, a record of excellence. You know, those are one of the things that mitigates these types of factors. Obviously, was it a system, a policy, or a training issue? This is the sad part here, because this is our responsibility as well. When the union brings forward, hey, look, you had a demonstrated culture of acceptance, or this was a practice that was well known. So most times when you're talking about discipline, you're not going to try to affect discipline with respect to something that's, following along a culture of acceptance or a practice. Next slide. And these are aggravating factors, obviously a high degree of operational impact, whether it's in the community or not. It can be behind the scenes. It could be in an evidence room. It could be anywhere. So unreceptive to corrective, displaying poor attitudes. That's crucial when you're talking about some of the lower levels. When it gets to the higher level ones, we're a little bit less sympathetic about, displaying poor attitudes. Those are so egregious, their attitude speaks for itself. Are they uncooperative with the investigation? Did they delay reports or attempt to conceal, or didn't offer information for us? High value or dollar loss, vehicle conditions where a speed is excessive, multiple vehicle preventable collisions within 36 months. That's kind of that period I was talking about, the 3-year deal. Bias or harassment-based actions, those are aggravating factors. When it ends up being one of those, that aggravates whatever level we're talking about. Rank or tenure in the position and lack of due regard, obviously constitutional implications. Next slide. Let's pause right here. This is a, kind of a summary thing. Next slide. I think I asked for questions right here. Yeah, I did. All right, let's go ahead and go to, if there are any questions up to this point, or how am I doing on time, Kim?
You're doing great on time. We're still only at 5:45. And I'll just wait and see if there's any hands. Valerie, please.
Hi, thanks so much for that very informative and helpful presentation. I guess one of the questions I have is where, the discipline process interfaces with the community. So at what point do community members become informed about discipline issues and, have some transparency involved?
Well, right at the beginning, when a community member makes a complaint. So that's always going to be the genesis of any type of discipline, is due process. So the officers have due process. They have their own well-established ability to expect us to bring forward evidence, bring forward some type of substantive reasons for discipline. The community member is informed at the beginning that this is what we heard you say. This is the complaint. We make sure that we've clarified what the substance of their complaint was. So oftentimes that's done ad hoc in the field, where a sergeant will take a phone call or get the initial, the emotional side of somebody making a complaint in the lobby. And then we'll recontact that person afterwards to say, hey, you made a complaint on this night. Is there any other information? And shore up the facts and the details and the circumstances, the basis of what was said. So that's that first point of contact for transparency, is just making sure that I heard you say this.
Sure.
And then recording that to make sure that's accurate. At that point, it comes to either Commander McDonald or I, and we establish what policies, rules, or violations took place. And once that's done, then we begin the process of notifying the officers and begin to do that process. Now, along the way, our expectation is 30 to 90 days. There's gates involved, depending on the seriousness or the complication of an investigation, where a community member would be notified or advised, hey, we're still working on your complaint. Sergeant Rogers has been assigned as your investigator. If there's any other witnesses or any other information you have, If there's any other medical records or injury processes, we'd be willing to take those in order to assess. So we try to reach out. Each investigator kind of does his own or her own style on that. But there are hard gates, 30 to 90 days, where the chief's office gets a tickler and says, hey, have you reached out to that person? And we have to respond back. Actually, the lieutenants or the sergeants have to respond back to Commander McDonald and I to make sure that we're doing that. And then along that path, all the way till we come to a resolution one way or the other, whether discipline takes place or discipline doesn't take place, we make a finding, a determination on that preponderance of evidence that's required for an employee complaint. So we don't have to
Sure.
find.
So that makes sense, transparent the specifics. I would expect that you would communicate with the person who made that complaint about the ultimate resolution of the matter. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then if a community member has a question about, more global statistics about complaints that are made and how they're resolved, is that information that's knowable or available to the public?
Yes. It's on our transparency page.
Okay.
I think Commander McDonald was talking about being able to reply to that as well, too. So if somebody was interested, they'd be able to go down in to say how many times, how many complaints, over what period of time. The one thing we won't do is share how many complaints by one officer. Individual statistics won't be
Okay.
shared.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, Jimmy, you're up.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. All right. Let me drop my hand since I'm now going to be. So I have several questions, and I'm trying to figure out which one is I should ask now and maybe save some for later. So I'm going to jump right into this. So these are excellent points, and the intent is obviously really clear as to what the department is looking at with this position. As a duly appointed PSAB group, I think we're asked not only to take a look at what it is that the department wants to do in order to affect itself as a more efficient organization, but I think we as the board are also looking at what the department can do better to ensure that the community as a whole has a say in how the department operates. And as such, this position works well relative to, in some respects, a one-way type of street. It's inside the department, it focuses on the department, and in that sense, I don't see a lot of community engagement activity relative to this particular position. One of the challenges, at least in my experience, one of the challenges in looking at internal affairs types of operations is that there's a sense of a black hole, that information comes in, not a lot of information comes out. And when a lot of information doesn't come out, that's when the community begins to feel as though there is no serious movement toward community engagement because things are happening behind the scene and very little information gets out. So I have a thought. And the thought is perhaps this position should be part of a two-pronged attack. That one part of it is utilizing, the police, the ethical standards position, and also looking at how the community itself can be engaged in partnership with that type of position. Now, whether we call that an ombudsman, whether we call that a community review board, we're not, at least in Jimmy Brown's view of the world, we are not here just to look at how do we engage the department to be better by looking specifically at police resources. What about engaging community-oriented resources as part of this process? And so that way, not only are we looking to connect for a better police department, but we're also looking to connect with a community that says, through these processes, we have a sense that the department is really looking to improve the lot of all of us in the community. And granted, again, I know this is a little bit outside of just looking at the standards position, but I see this as being an opportunity for a connection.
I appreciate those comments, Jimmy. I would tell you that within our organization, the professional standards sergeant for a division commander such as me allows somebody, Lieutenant Fox recently promoted. I think you guys are well aware of him. He was in the beta position while this was going on. That allowed us, for one of the first times as an agency, to have a professional that actually has been trained, is in a position where he's not or she's not within a direct chain of command. So you don't have a vested interest in covering anything up or making something look rosy. You call it like it is. Anytime you end up having an inspector or some type of a professional standards position, it just gives you that opportunity to become good at doing one facet of law enforcement. We ask our members who investigate child abuse or homicides or traffic collisions to have extra specialities in that. Just because you put on sergeant stripes or lieutenant bars doesn't turn you into a professional standards or an internal affairs expert. There's a lot that goes into it to ensure that they have a consistent preparation and they have those skills and abilities to do it. I had ended up going to a couple different internal affairs classes through my years of being in law enforcement, but I was never in the position full time. So having been to 2 or 3, week-long classes, it's hard to do that if you don't get into the practice of doing it all the time. So dealing with community members, being able to be aware of transparency, looking at statistics, making sure that you're running down those, and talking to other internal affairs investigators. I think this professional standards position would give us one of those first opportunities at the size of organization we are, where we can start expecting better. So that kind of gropes towards what I think Valerie was saying, and I think towards what Jimmy was saying also. I appreciate both of you guys' comments on that. Anybody else?
I think the chief had something to add.
Yeah, thank you. Before the rest of the questions come up, Jimmy, to your point, that is definitely a topic of discussion in a lot of different communities or cities. More cities than in the county region is a community oversight to an ombudsman. I had it in Tacoma, their ability to look at all complaints. They were all redacted and weigh in on it. They only could see the one letter of the investigation, so not the entire packet. And then, of course, Port of Portland or City of Portland has a more robust system that I was able to learn about when I was still in Tacoma. So I hear what you're saying. In respect to the professional standards, it was my attempt to get closer to an internal affairs. We're not the right size nor the volume to have an internal affairs unit. And so by having a professional standards sergeant, it is basically my IA investigator for those more serious violations that Commander Rogers has illustrated that would hit that criteria, plus do a lot of other things that an internal affairs unit would just do complaints, where a professional standards, they'll do the complaints, but they'll also do, the data research, the use of force analysis, and help us out with other parts of the workload that we need help in. So a little bit different, but yeah, the other aspect of this, the more of the community side engagement is in a whole different process that can be incorporated, and this group can take a look at the various models they choose to and bring it forward to this to the board for discussions. The Public Safety Advisory Board is probably the first step where you're just overseeing it and you have a time limit. But again, there are community oversight that do meet on quarterly basis, do review these, and have some are asking for more, like they want to interview and basically come up with recommendations themselves. And those are, you're usually talking about your, over 1,000 sworn type agencies that are needing that type of oversight or the demand for that.
Jimmy, please continue.
Thank you. Chief, I totally appreciate what you're saying. And I know that like minds do tend to kind of walk down a similar kind of pathway. So your words give me a lot of hope. I'm not exactly saying that what happens in Portland, what happens in Gresham, what happens in Los Angeles is right for what happens in Tigard. What I do want to think in terms of is that the standards position fits within, I think, what the community has said we would like to see relative to how the police department operates internally. The PSAB is saying, given the circumstances that caused City Council to look at establishing a PSAB, and maybe even so unintentionally to say, this could be the formative piece for a type of or a model of a community review board. And I'm not trying to get into the weeds or the specifics of what that would look like, but just utilizing that terminology. I think that by having something that is a companion piece to the standards position, you now are going to have, I believe, a community that is more engaged because they will believe that the department truly is looking at not only staying inside of a police model, but incorporating or including a community-oriented model along with that.
Thank you, Jimmy, for that comment. I'm jotting that down as definitely a potential future recommendation. So when we start talking about recommendations from this piece, we can come back to it. Judge Michael O'Brien, please.
Thank you. Just going back to the last slide, I'm wondering if you might give us some sense of when constitutional implications rise to the level of an aggravating circumstance. Obviously, traffic stops, for example, are challenged all the time, and occasionally a judge might disagree in a DUI case when a defense attorney challenges the constitutional grounds for a traffic stop, whether it's probable cause or whatever. When does that become a problem in terms of discipline?
Yeah, mainly when it comes to search and seizure, Your Honor.
Mm-hmm.
So when an officer has been told that during certain conditions they're allowed to make searches, they choose to do something outside of that pale, we end up identifying that they knew that constitutional right. And it also comes to play when you're talking about excessive force as well. So any one of those constitutionally protected rights that we have as a community member, as a citizen in this country. And we identify that took place. So obviously due process or any one of those other rights.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Justin, please.
Hi there. Thank you, Commander Rogers. I did have a follow-up question regarding one of the questions that Valerie had earlier, which was about resolution of incidents. And you had mentioned something about those reports existing on the transparency website. And I wanted to go and see and find what those looked like. However, my first question and issue that I'm countering is I don't see it anywhere on the Tigard Police Transparency page. There's a lot of aggregate data about use of force responses and strategic dashboards, but I don't see anything related to incidents and complaints related to officers. And then I have a second follow-up question after you address that first point.
Okay, so annually, the police department prepares an annual report where the chief's office has an entire portion that's dedicated to complaints that were intake, how many were racial and bias based, how many that fell into certain categories. So that should be available. It may not be down into what would be classified as a report or an individual reported, but it should be as aggregated as well. So it won't just be use of force data. That should be within our annual report. And
Okay, so the general question that I have here then is that there are no individual reports posted of like individual incidents. Got it. Okay. And then my second question, diving a little deeper, is you had mentioned to Valerie that the public and civilians cannot see or visualize how many incidents or misconduct investigations have been conducted on any one officer. Is that correct?
yeah, that is correct. Our
Okay.
police department doesn't produce those. You'd have to ask the city attorney with respect to records, release or retention of those types of documents. We don't produce past complaints for officers per se. It just doesn't take place like that. So, and there's employee and other issues that we're not allowed to review that.
Got it. And so is that because it is an employment issue, or is it related to the city issue? Is it a city issue then that falls on the city of Tigard and, for example, like City Attorney Rahala?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that specifically. I know that we don't release anything that has to do with discipline related. I do believe it's one of those administrative rules, but I'd leave that up to Shelby to be able to put smart words behind that.
Yeah, so that's actually governed both by state statute as well as employment law. So there are some things under Oregon Public Records law related to employee discipline that that is conditionally exempt, which means that the presumption is that it's not releasable, but a person can make an argument that it's in the public interest to release it. And so there are some cases, especially with police officers, that it can be released just because public interest is so high in making sure there's accountability for police officers. But yeah, there is public records. And then, like Commander Rogers said, typically just personal employment actions, that is confidential generally. So there's overlays with the collective bargaining agreements and just general rights for employees of the city of Tigard.
Got it. So it's related to collective bargaining agreements and employer rights. Thank you for those responses. I had followed and done a little bit of work in the House Committee Judiciary bills during the legislature. And I know that there were bills that were passed related to allowing civilian review boards and oversight groups to begin this process of maybe accessing this data in the public's interest, as City Attorney Rahala had mentioned. So I appreciate you all being able to answer my questions as it relates to civilian oversight and transparency. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. And Jeff, please.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Commander Rogers, for the presentation and for answering our questions. My thought process is along the same lines as Jimmy, Justin, and others around the transparency piece of it and the public being able to see not only the result of an internal investigation, but states like California have laws on the books that make publicly available all documents and recordings around internal investigations to provide like the utmost level of transparency. And I think that's the perfect world for providing confidence to the community that the police are doing their job and serving and protecting. Is the release of I understand it's statute, union, a lot of things that are keeping individual recordings or investigations from being released, but I'm curious to hear from the department your thoughts on if you would support that changing in the future, if you would be open to making internal investigations publicly available.
Leave that up to the chief to give opinions about our department.
It's one thing if an entire state goes down that road versus, one department or one city by another. I see both sides. That's my problem. I do. And when I understand the trust and they want to see all of that. And at the same time, as an employee, I think it has to be a certain level of threshold, right? Where, as Shelby indicated, maybe utmost interest of the community. So you're talking about the ones that we probably terminate or give extensive days off or even demote, as opposed to somebody who just got a written reprimand and get into those. I have no problems with releasing, getting to a point where very similar to the I sit on the police policy board for DPSST to review certifications. And at the end of that is, Officer A did this and this was the determination. So they give the community far more information. And all officers get to see that as well, so that maybe they can sit there and go, "Ooh, I don't ever want to do that," or "If I'm thinking about that, better not do that." And those we would all say those are helpful without needing a name to be put behind it. And I'm definitely all for learning from other people's mistakes without having to call out their names. So I'm probably sitting somewhat on the fence as to all or a portion at this point.
Cool, thank you. Also, I have a couple more smaller questions, I guess. What kind of misconduct leads to counseling versus discipline? Because it seems like discipline, all the records are saved, everything is, internally there, where counseling, things can fall off. But I just curious of examples for each.
Well, like any job, you end up having those issues of the hands where somebody just makes a mistake. So you end up having a really shabby report. It's hard to follow. Perhaps the officer was tired. You end up making a lot of corrections on the report. You meet with the officer, that's counseling.
Okay.
You have the issues of the head where they were supposed to know something. You charged the wrong statute or you put them into the wrong court. So that's a little bit more serious. And then there's those issues of the heart where you're talking about intentionality. Somebody does something intentional. So they either threw away evidence, they decided not to charge somebody with something that the officers expected to do. So perhaps it was a complicated crash and there was a clear causal factor and you should have cited that person. Perhaps it was even a traffic crime involved. Those are expectations where, yeah, I knew that, Sergeant, but I chose just to do it because I didn't want to do it. It was too much complication. It was too much of an effort. So those are like the way we as supervisors over time, just like good coaches do. Like anybody else who's a great supervisor or a great boss, you're trying to tell an employee, hey, my expectations are higher from you. Maybe you'll get better, those issues of the hand. Then you have the head, then you have the heart. So those are kind of the way we'd like to describe it in the field. Commander McDonald and I are both, sports fanatics, and having been involved in sports for years, it's always about teaching. It's always about making that person better in their trade. And as we go down through this process, whether it's discipline, counseling, or even professional changes within law enforcement, we're okay with that. We're okay with body-worn cameras. We're okay with being able to see what we did, as long as the officers feel confident that we're not picking them. We're not pulling apart each thing they do. No human can work in an environment where they feel like they have an unblinking eye of Sauron watching them all the time. We ask our officers to be creative thinkers in the moment, to use their heart, to go out and if you make a mistake, do it because it's from the right point of view. So I hope that makes sense, sir. I really do. It's just those, there's so much of a difference between counseling and coaching and then getting to something that's discipline. It just doesn't happen that often.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And I work for one of the local sportswear companies, so I'm following the sports analogies pretty well. So thank you. My last question is around the timing of resolution for complaint. You mentioned 30 to 90 days. Is one of the goals of this new position to reduce that time frame? No.
I will tell you, especially because we're recording this, we're trying to hold ourselves to 30 to 90 days. Our chief will laugh when I say 30 to 90 days. That is an effort because we want to say, without a professional standards supervisor, or a sergeant to help us. It's so hard for a sergeant on the road or a lieutenant on the road to also do all their other duties, plus be good leaders, plus be great supervisors, and then conduct comprehensive and thorough investigations within a closed period of time. So my point is, we're working hard to get the 30, 90 day, and then asking the chief for that extra permission to go beyond that. And we'd have to have justifications or explanations why. That's what Commander McDonald and I are trying to do. Professional standards has helped us do that, but I don't see it happening faster than that. Due process and doing a fair investigation takes a certain period of time.
Thanks so much.
And Chief, please.
And, to add on that, which is a great question to manage your expectations on this position. As the commander said, if it's handled by a patrol sergeant, so it's a low level 1, you're talking about days off rotations and then maybe meeting up with the officers because they don't have the same days on and off, and then getting a hold of any potential witnesses. So they tend to be a little bit longer just from logistics themselves and making sure that people respond back, as well as he said, managing the calls for service out in the field. However, with the professional standards, yes, you get that consistency. That's often when there's a complaint, that will be their full-time focus, but they're also getting the more complex. And so often those require, getting the videos, talking to more people. So they could take longer than a more simple, but it'll be for different reasons. It'll be for the complexity. But I think if we look back on Sergeant Fox's product, he's been able to turn these around in a very consistent and reasonable manner, depending on the complexity and how cooperative other individuals are.
Thanks, Chief. And Jimmy, please.
I want to thank everyone that has asked questions of Sergeant Rogers, and also I want to thank him for the presentation, because I do think it has been really quite thorough. I want to go back to and maybe Kim, we can put this up. I want to go back to the pyramid, the leveling system pyramid, because I have a comment toward that.
Yes, I also just want to note that there is still the second half of the presentation.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll be quick. So this relates to level 2, policy violations that negatively impact operations, serious misuse, of unprofessional behavior. And in the example is listed as level 2 violation or level 2 issue discipline would be the use of racial epithets. And that concerns me. It concerns me in the sense that if you have an officer that is using racially charged language or dropping the N-word or such kinds of references to people's ethnicity, that to me says that may not be an officer that you want to give an opportunity to move to a level 1 situation where racial profiling or willful civil rights violations are occurring, because to me it's almost a hand-in-glove type of situation. If you're going to use that type of terminology around a person of color, it probably isn't going to take much more than a half a step to get to the next piece. And so my sense is that if the violation relates to a professional standards orientation of 40 to 240 hour suspensions, possibly involuntary demotion, I'm not sure that's the type of officer I want walking around on my streets. If you're going to just toss those words out there, it's more than just tossing the words. There is, there's more to it than just calling out a person of color, we'll say an African American, if he's involved in some type of situation dropping the N word on it to what? Gain compliance? Because that ain't gonna happen. You're just gonna simply charge me up even more so. So I would look at these examples, and I know they're not there in their entirety. I know it's just you're putting some things out there as potential elements that would cause someone to be in a specific discipline level. But that piece of it, just I'm sorry, it stings to me. I don't want an officer on the force that feels comfortable using that type of language.
Chief.
Jimmy, excellent catch is what I can tell you. This was in place prior to, not that it's acceptable at any time, but I will tell you why I too agree that it could go up to the level 1 is because, part of police reform after George Floyd and Oregon law is that that bias-based complaint would go to DPSST for review for certification. So it would go up to there because it could, even if a chief did not dismiss somebody, it could be reviewed under DPSST. Let's say a chief did the 40-hour suspension in a last chance work agreement. DPSST board could look at this and opted to decertify somebody. And so I think this is just why many eyes is nice to have on this, and definitely will take this back under advisement and make some corrections. We worked very close with the union on this, and like I said, this was done prior to the most recent legislative updates.
Well, it's good because my trifocals give me 5 cents.
Thank you. And any other questions on the first half of the presentation before Commander Rogers takes us back in? Great. Go ahead, Commander.
Here we go. Can you hear me now? All right, so intake of complaints, personnel complaints within our department are guided by a policy 1020. It's a pretty long, and it's been edited over the last couple years to be very detailed. As we went through the accreditation process with the Oregon Accreditation Alliance, much of the stuff that was informally in directives or cobbled together just through experiences was specifically identified and put into some type of a coherent manner. So what we've done is we professionalized what intakes look like and have given guidance to all members of the department what our expectations are with respect to taking on complaints, or what we call the intake process. Here's just a couple bullets. They kind of speak for themselves. We take all complaints seriously, even ones that on their face can be disproven right from the beginning using some type of a technological solution. We still take the complaints in, and we still give them the seriousness of trying to appreciate what could we learn from that incident. The next one, we'll accept complaints of misconduct in accordance with policies and compare them to all the applicable federal, state, and local laws, municipal, county rules, and the requirements of any of the collective bargaining agreements. That's kind of our standards we have to compare it to, so the officers know what their expectations are. What are you going to hold me accountable for? It's the policy of the department to ensure the community can report misconduct without concerns of reprisal or retaliation. That's only happened a couple of times in my experience where someone has made a claim after the fact that they felt that they were being given an extra level of scrutiny, or more patrolling in a certain area or an apartment complex in a retaliatory manner. The judge might remember several of those from his courtroom in the years we spent together, where you would end up having an officer that would work a certain area, and a motorist might feel that they were being specifically targeted. It's just one of those things where an officer might work a certain area. So we're able to navigate some of those, but we're still going to take that under consideration And we're going to confront the officer to make sure they're aware of it as well, that there's been an allegation. Doesn't happen that often though. Complaints also include allegations of misconduct or improper job performance that, if true, and violate policies or laws or ordinances, can be generated internally by our own officers, our own members, our own record staff. So if they see something that's done in contravention of a policy or a law or an ordinance, or by the public. Next slide. Okay, the following applies to the sources of the complaints. Obviously, individuals from the public may make complaints in any form, and I've seen them taken almost in any manner. Sometimes we get them third party from the mayor's executive assistant forwarded to the chief's executive assistant in a voicemail. And we have to boil down, even if it's anonymous, what was the substance of the complaint. So I've seen them come in almost any manner. Any department member becoming aware of an alleged misconduct shall notify a supervisor. So one example, we just got body worn cameras not long ago, as you remember. And as one of the division commanders, I wear one all the time in uniform. Well, there's been times where I'm required to notify the community member that I'm recording them. It's a matter of policy. I have to tell them, you know, I'm Officer Rogers with the police department. I'm recording this conversation. Well, I forgot a couple different times and literally had to go in and report that to the chief because that's a violation of policy. She's given me remediation and I've tried to get better. It's one of those things that at least I'm remembering to turn it on. So even an old dog is learning this new process. So you have to report policy violations to your supervisor. And when you become aware of them, you have to do that. Supervisors shall initiate a complaint based on observed misconduct or a receipt from any source alleging misconduct, if true, that could result in a disciplinary action. So that's where you end up hearing something, as Mr. Brown was talking about, where there's a racial epithet or some type of a comment. You write that down, you make sure that it's been written down, and then you do the investigation. The whole point is you don't go seek first to clarify. You write down the allegation. You make sure that it's written down and clear. You clarify at the front end of what the allegation is, but you don't go to the employee first and confront them. That's not the way it's done. If true, that could result in disciplinary action. It's something that's significant. So anonymous and third-party complaints will be accepted. It says should be accepted, but we do. And they'll be investigated to the extent that sufficient information is provided. Tort claims and lawsuits may generate a personnel complaint. Next slide, they do. We always generate an investigation. Complaint process and procedures. It's a responsibility of all supervisors to receive any and all allegations. It's just part of your job. And when we onboard new sergeants, we make sure that that's clear to them. Your job isn't to try and make somebody feel good with the poor service that they believe they encountered. It's to understand what they said, write that down. And if there's an allegation that we can follow up with, then we're going to do that. If a supervisor is not available, it's the responsibility of any member who becomes aware of an allegation to receive it. Those intake forms are completed and forwarded to a division commander. So if a supervisor is not present, usually a senior officer will take that on, but it can be a record specialist. It could be, the confidential executive assistant over the phone. As I mentioned, there's several people who have touch points with the community, our PIO and community engagement, SROs. In the event the investigation or the allegation involves a command level officer, obviously it's forwarded directly to the chief. If a complaint involves an allegation about the chief's misconduct, which has happened, it gets forwarded to the city manager. So a supervisor may attempt to resolve an allegation by explaining department policies and procedures, and will note that on the intake. So there have been multiple times where an officer has been driving in a manner that drew the attention of a community member. And then we're able to explain later what took place and the fact that there are times where having lights and siren on give warning to a suspect we're trying to take into custody. And that was a direct response. So we're able to review that and explain it to the community member, and perhaps they're fine with that. If they're not, we're still going to write the allegation down. We're still going to investigate it, but at least we're able to explain to them on the front end to resolve that allegation by explaining the policy or a procedure. And that's just one example. Next slide. Upon the receipt of an allegation, the division commander, either Commander McDonald or I, generally it's patrol, shall determine whether it alleges a violation of policy, procedure, or law. That's where basically similar to what a prosecutor does. You end up identifying what charge, what statute, what degree, what focus. If the allegation does not rise to the level of a complaint, the division commander shall send a letter to the complainant advising them on their decision. So sometimes it ends up being one of those circumstances where it just doesn't rise to the level of a complaint. They're unhappy with service that was provided during an encounter, and we're able to explain to them, we followed our policies, we followed the law, we're sorry. We're able to send them a letter that basically has the vernacular that we do appreciate them giving us an opportunity to review the matter to get better. But I would be sending that letter, or the chief would send the letter, one or the other. Copies will be sent to the affected officer as well, and the inspections officer for entry into that database, which we do keep track of pretty much any allegation that's gone on paper, and they all go on paper. So next slide. If the allegation doesn't rise to the level of complaint, the inspections office, or if it does, I'm sorry, if the allegation does rise to a level of a complaint, the inspections officer then will evaluate to determine which process is applicable. There is a mediation setup where you can actually have an officer and a community member meet on a neutral ground with a prepared and trained mediator and resolve some types of issues. You both get if you need more information on mediation, we can go into that topic later, but it's actually a pretty productive resolution. It's infrequently used, unfortunately. It generally happens around community issues between community members, not so much with law enforcement, but it is an alternative. There are non-disciplinary investigations where we're still going to go through the due diligence of looking into what was the kind of the morphology of what took place. Why did we end up doing certain acts that ended up causing a complaint from the community? One thing that happens oftentimes in a city is when we end up doing what we call loud containment for a canine track. So in the middle of the night, you have a police officer going up and down your street, kicking on their siren, and it wakes up your family, and you're like, what are you guys doing? And they're maybe out there for a half hour to an hour. It's just ridiculous. Turns out we're trying to corral a suspect from leaving a certain area by using noise and our lights to make it obviously a physical deterrent as well as an auditory one, where they know that we're still surrounding them. Well, that can be quite annoying. So that's one example where we've done a non-disciplinary investigation and tried to look into how long did we need to hold that? Why did we need to do it for an hour and a half or 2 hours? Oh, it's a little bit excessive. And then we talk about that amongst ourselves just to become better. Whether we found the person or not, the whole point is you look into it from a non-disciplinary perspective. Disciplinary investigations speak for themselves. They're complicated. They require us ensuring that we set aside our biases as well. Police officers are really good at that confirmation bias. We end up going into many types of investigations, and we look for somebody we know that a crime's been committed because we have either victims or we have evidence of a crime, and we're looking for someone within an investigation to find evidence that they did that. Well, what we have to make sure we do when it comes to employee investigations with respect to any type of a due process investigation is not having confirmation bias, looking to find that the officer was already wrong before we even talked to witnesses, established any basis of evidence, did any other type of interviews. We just have to make sure we do due process and due diligence as well. Labor and employment law is very strong within the state of Oregon, unlike several other states across the country. Granted, I would say it expects a higher level of professionalism for us in regards to our investigation, so we do a better job. The price is you end up having to put more time and effort into them. And then the last one is criminal investigations, where you end up having an outside agency or a group of professionals do the investigation on a member of your department. to establish whether a crime has been committed or some type of a civil rights violation. The FBI is adept at doing that, but so is the Oregon Department of Justice. Obviously, temporary relief from duty. That's something that's delegated from the chief's office by policy to any supervisor that can suspend a member with pay for a period of time. It's usually until the next duty day where the chief is in the office. That's pending the completion of a formal investigation. So a relief for duty would be perhaps down the angle of some type of an employee argument where one employee ends up threatening another employee, or because of one circumstance or another, a supervisor says, you two are going home. You relieve them from duty. They go home. You prepare the documents, send it up to the chain of command, who gets notified that night. And then we call and talk to the chief saying, hey, look, we had officers that were outside of the expectations of employee workspace. I can't even say that it happens very frequently. Normally it has to do with some type of an encounter where a criminal allegation has taken place as well. They've either been charged with reckless driving, or through the years I've seen driving under the influence being one of those where you relieve the person of duty and they're kept on the sidelines until you can end up establishing whether they're going to be brought back to work within the chief's office discretion. Next slide. Bias-based profiling is a specific area that has been identified and tracked by the Oregon Department of Justice for about the last 5 years. So there's a specific form that has to be filled out in tandem with whatever department policies or recording mechanisms. We have a standard complaint form, but there's also another reporting mechanism that gets reported to the state. Commander McDonald will explain that. It's in his role as the services commander to prepare a report annually to the chief's office. There's an Oregon revised statute that guides what chief law enforcement officers have to do. It contains all the details required and the outcomes of the complaints. All sources and involved persons' data is anonymized. And then the state prepares a report. I believe it's for the governor, but perhaps the state legislature as well, that goes into that bias-based profiling complaint. Next slide. All right, we're getting close to wrapping up. Thanks for your attention. This just kind of begins to talk about the collective bargaining agreement within the Tigard Police Officers Association in the city of Tigard. A collective bargaining agreement exists. And one addendum, this is just the first line, talks about the disciplinary investigation procedures, where they've negotiated and we've agreed to through the years a set of details. Our contract's online if you guys want to go through all the way down to addendum B. I could do a whole series of discussions about this, but one thing, just one example is an advance notice prior to any disciplinary investigation, which could result in a suspension or discharge. Those are both two things that have to be reported to DPSST, so it makes sense that it's going to be an elevated level of notice. The employee concerned shall be notified not less than 24 hours before an interview. Or such time as written reports are required, except when, in the opinion of the city, a delay will jeopardize the success of the investigation or when a criminal conduct is at issue. So we've had those times where a 24-hour notice isn't apropos, but it's a rarity. This is just one example I'm trying to share with you that unlike TV or other examples you've heard where police supervisors can drag an officer in and put on bright lights and sweat them into what took place, just doesn't work that way in a professional law enforcement world. When we confront the officers with whatever, we try to do it as patiently, as thoughtfully, and as prepared as possible, and giving them notice in advance so they can have representation that they're entitled to and afforded to. This notice allows them to prepare that before they end up coming in. It does nothing but help us having them be as professionally prepared as we are. Next slide. All right. Now we're back on the question phase.
Yes. So any questions? Jimmy, please.
Again, a really good presentation and very, very clear in the information that you shared. Relating to the last piece, and this kind of goes back to the triangle, which had, you know, different levels of activity. Level 5 and 4, and I think possibly 3, is representation required in any of those levels, or is it only in effectively 2 and above? Here we go.
If discipline can result, then the member is afforded the opportunity to have a representative.
Right.
But I would tell you this, in practice, Jimmy, we give members the opportunity to have somebody else with them if it's going to be a formalized. So when you're talking about level 2 there, minor policy violations, even when it's in my mind that this isn't going to result in discipline, I afford them the opportunity to have a union representative. And you could ask Commander McDonald how he handles it. I've always believed that a union representative helps, just like I've always believed when a suspect wants to have an attorney, I'll let him have an attorney. An attorney never hurts the opportunity for us to have clear, thoughtful discussions. They're informed, I'm informed. So in my opinion, is it required? No, it's not required unless discipline is going to take place.
And Commander McDonald?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. In practice, we're affording the employee every opportunity to have a representative if they choose. And Nick Nunn is here too, and Nick can speak to that. It's one of those things that it stands to, one, the professionalism of the agency as well. So we've got nothing to hide when we're doing these investigations. The officers or the union themselves, they want to hold people accountable if somebody has violated policy, or worse yet, violated a law.
So, you know, that makes lots of sense that you're offering the officer an opportunity to have, you know, someone else engaged in this particular process. And I'm just going to say, in that same vein, because that may be an internal police activity situation, it's that very reason that I think having a community-oriented position, an ombudsman perhaps, to look at it as well, not necessarily again on the discipline side of things, but to look at and have another set of eyes around how the department conducts its business. If we're able to, per the agreement, the labor agreement, have a union representative engaged in a process, I look at this and say, you know, the department really does work for the community, and as such, the community can have someone represented inside of the department operations.
Thanks, Jimmy. And I think Officer Nunn had something to add.
Yeah, I was just going to add regarding the union representation. On most of those, we're aware of the IA, we know, or the investigation, we know what's going on to some degree. And we just afford our union members, you know, representation. We'd say, this is who's going to be available. We have a certain members that are kind of usually do these. And so we say, you know, this person's available if you want one of us to sit with you. When it's more of a major, like a, you know, area 1, and we're facing, you know, more heavy discipline, sometimes there's attorneys involved too. So it's, you know, the lower levels, it's usually just one of us sitting in there with an employee. But at other times there could be attorneys involved as well.
Thank you, Officer. Any other questions or comments about the second half of the presentation? Great. Thank you very much, Commander Rogers, for joining us this evening.
Yeah, it was an honor. I appreciate you guys. Take care. If there's any other follow-ups, Commander McDonald told me earlier he loves answering questions. So please come up with anything and just send it to him. He loves this. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And now we have kind of two different tracks we can take for the rest of this evening in our last 20 minutes. But first I want to ask the chief, did you have a timeline where you would like to see the endorsement by the PSAB of the professional standard sergeant? Is there some urgency related to that?
Yes, there is. We're already starting this fiscal year budget process. I've already made this presentation to the city manager. He's aware of it. This is one that is, on what he calls a priority one in his opinion. And so if we can meet have something either yay or nay by January 24th, that would be consistent with the timelines for our other budget preparation.
Thank you, Chief. And John, please.
Yes, I appreciate the presentation, and thank you, Chief, for that. My question would be in terms of what are we losing in terms of a transit officer?
In my opinion, nothing, in the sense that since I've been here, now this is a longstanding program, and since I've been here, we have slowly decreased our footprint there. It used to be the advantage both ways was we were well embedded because we do have TriMet coming in. We were talking about the Southwest corridor and the potential for light rail to come through, where we'd want to keep our footprint. I've seen more, what I would say, headaches than I have seen rewards. And so, I'm always open. I've had meetings, but at this point, I am not an advocate of joining anytime soon and don't anticipate it to do so. But happy to have Commander Rogers also jump in, since, like I said, he has been the direct point of contact the last couple of years.
Commander Rogers has flown the coop, but we've got Commander McDonald with his hand up.
He is a capable individual too, so he can also talk about this.
Yeah, Chief, I just wanted to add, one of the things, John, that really is a big deal to us is when we send people to the Transit Police Division, they're almost exclusively very experienced officers. Most of them are field training officers. And since we have so many new hires that we're trying to get through training right now, they're really critical to have at home, right? And the Transit Police has undergone a very significant change in how they operate over probably the last 3 or 4 years. And I think that it's fair to say that we think it's most accountable to this community that we reassess that before we send any more officers or supervisors to be a part of that team, because it has changed so much in the way that they operate that it's probably in this community's best interest to take a look at it and make sure that before we jump back in, that some boxes have been checked and that we can be more assured that it's going to meet the expectations of people in Tigard, rather than being accountable to other communities in the metro area. So I think that's probably the best thing, is it's just undergone a really big change in the last few years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commander. Thank you, John, for the question. Any other questions about the professional sergeant's position before I pull up the draft recommendation language? Okay, so here's the draft recommendation. This is language that is all based upon the chief's memo that got sent out a couple of weeks ago. It goes into the recommendation to convert the transit sergeant position into the professional standard sergeant position. It lists several of the duties that will include but are not limited to, and then talks about how this recommendation can promote racial equity and anti-racism in the community through the services that this position would offer. Any comments, suggestions, questions, amendments to the recommendation? Jimmy, please.
It really isn't the Jimmy Brown show, but but you know, the work that is done by the department, I really want to say I support the work that has been done. I do feel as though, you know, we are all in this process together, and at the same time, I feel as though a lot of the onus for the work is really oriented, especially within this position, oriented toward the department itself, which, you know, I don't have a challenge with that, but I'm looking at the PSAB having a role in ensuring that the department goes above and beyond what might work best to bring the organization into, you know, a much more efficient and effective operation. I think, as such, I think what this lacks is the companion piece, which is the creation of, in addition to a professional standards sergeant, the creation of, and I'm just using this as a description, we could always wordsmith a more appropriate description, an ombudsman position that would also work in consort with the professional standards sergeant to ensure that the community at large feels that the department and the city are inclusive in their promotion of racial equity and anti-racism in the community.
Jimmy, I hear you. Would you be willing to take the lead on coming up with what that recommendation, that companion recommendation could look like?
Oh, Kim. Of course. I mean, of course I could do that. I would be happy to do that.
But you seem to have a very clear vision for what you're looking for, and I think it would help everybody to have that in front of us.
Sure, I would be happy to do that.
Thank you.
And have it ready in time for the next meeting.
Yeah, and the next meeting is on the 24th, which is the chief's deadline when she would like to either have an endorsement or not from this board. So I think that would work.
I will have it prior to the meeting, and then you all can send it out to the group as a whole so we can have some digesting time before it gets discussed in the meeting.
Absolutely. And feel free to reach out to us and use us as a resource to help bounce any ideas off between now and then.
Perfect.
Thank you, Jimmy. And Chief, please.
Yeah, and Jimmy, in your research or proposal, my concern is, it sounds like you want the city to fund a ombudsman position. And if so, my concern is just lack of work in volume. So in your research or proposal, would include possibly as needed, and you contract, or how does that look? And you don't have to answer it tonight, but my concern is, you know, from if you're hiring a city FTE or an outside entity, is there going to be volume for the contract dollars that it will take? So just if you will address that in your proposal also, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Chief. And Officer Nunn?
Yeah, and I don't know if this would raise, my concern would be privacy issues. You have a non-sworn individual that is now involved in investigation and possibly privacy issues between reports or officer information. So I believe you might be looking at some privacy issues in creating something like that as well.
Thank you, Officer. And Chief?
No, I just need to lower my hand.
Oh, okay. Valerie, please. Valerie, and then Justin, and then I think we're probably going to wrap up for the
No, I mean, I think conceptually, this is such a good idea. And I really applaud the department for taking these positive steps to move this forward. But I did want to volunteer to help Jimmy on this because I feel like we've asked him to do a lot recently. One question I did have is, I think a lot of the balancing act with what we've talked about tonight and what we've talked about over the last several sessions involves the collective bargaining agreement that we have with the police officers union. Is that something that we're going to be talking about as part of our discussions for this group? Because I would like to understand sort of where the nexus points are a little bit better. And I certainly think it's good that the police officers union has a voice, but I want to understand better how that interfaces with some of these issues of privacy and transparency.
That is not currently on the schedule, but I actually do have our schedule ready. We have 4 meetings kind of set up for this complaints and discipline, and so we'll talk to each other on the prep team and see if we can work in something around that topic as well.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Yep. And Justin, you are our final comment this evening.
Yeah, thank you. In response to one of the concerns that Officer Nunn had, I'm curious if the city attorney or any of the judges could look at Senate Bill 204, which recently passed in the legislature's long session. And I could see how the concern would be of a civilian, private citizen who's unsworn having access to sensitive information like this. And I was just wondering if this new law, which essentially would allow civilians and oversight boards to review information and access the state law enforcement data system, might cover this concern. And so I'm curious about that. And again, that is Senate Bill 204 from 2021.
Thank you, Justin. Chief, please.
Yeah, very quickly. Thank you, Justin, because I was going to talk to that and talk about the recent legislature and remind everybody that there is a statewide database that is expanding and putting that in, and all that infrastructure is being worked on. And again, I have part of that as a part of the police policy committee. So whether or not it satisfies what you are asking is to be seen, but I can, as part of this complaint process, I was going to talk about what the police policy board does, its authority and scope, and what has been expanded due to recent legislation. And then we can talk about that Senate bill, remind you of what that entails, if that will work for everybody.
Thank you, Chief. All the thumbs ups. And Sean, if it's all right with you, I'll move into next steps in our upcoming schedule.
Yes, please.
Great, thank you. And I just had this up. I'm going to put it up again. Our upcoming meeting schedules. So we just had our first meeting around the complaints and discipline process. We are scheduled for 3 more, including talking about recommendations. The next meeting will be discussing Jimmy and Valerie's recommendation, as well as the professional standard sergeant. And we'll look into some presentation around the collective bargaining agreement in the upcoming meetings. We also have MHRT. We sent out that great article that Nick Jarmer had found in the last meeting. We'll also be talking about ballot measure 110, which talks about decriminalization, and in general legislative updates. We'll be talking about traffic stops, which Judge Michael O'Brien has offered to help with that presentation using his experience from the bench, which I'm looking forward to. And then we'll be talking about school resource officers as well. We have one free meeting that hasn't been scheduled, which I think will help with making sure we can hit all of our beats between now and the end of June. And that's where we are this evening. So, Sean.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're out of time. It's 6:58. Thank you, everyone. Great presentation tonight and great discussion afterwards. I'd like to call for a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion or opposition?
It's my birthday today, just to let everybody know.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
birthday.
Happy birthday.
Getting ready for another trip around the sun.
We lost you. You went on mute.
Oh, I was just saying maybe 2 or 3 times. I don't know. Some people say 45 is old. I just say I'm more wiser. That's about it. I'm not at that point yet to call myself old, regardless of these grays going on. It's okay.
All right. With that, our meeting is adjourned. Everyone have a great night.
Good night.
Good night,
Good night.
everyone.